At our Sunday family dinner, my mother set her silver fork down on the table. She looked right at me and delivered her demand. Starting tomorrow, Brittany's boyfriend and his parents are moving into the guest wing. If you have a problem with that, you can move out. I sat at the head of my own dining table. The air conditioning hummed against the Mississippi summer heat outside, but the room felt ice cold. I stopped cutting my roast. Across from me, my 25-year-old sister Brittany smirked and picked up her wine glass. Next to her sat Travis, her boyfriend. He leaned back in my custom leather chair and picked at his teeth. He did not even look nervous. Gary and Brenda sold their place, my mother continued. They need a roof over their heads. The East Wing has 2 empty bedrooms. We help family Anna. They expected tears. They anticipated a shouting match. They wanted me to beg for boundaries so they could ignore them and call me selfish. Instead, I reached for my glass. I took a slow sip of iced, sweet tea. I felt the cold condensation on my fingers. I set the glass down and gave them a genuine, quiet smile. My mother frowned. The skin around her eyes tightened. "What is so funny to you?" I picked up my phone and swiped the screen. A text message sat in my inbox. Delivery confirmed. Target on site. "Nothing," I said. "Just enjoying the meal." 5 minutes later, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the foyer. Travis tossed his napkin onto his plate. "That is the pizza I ordered," he said, standing up. "I will get it." We heard the heavy front door swing open. Then a deep, unfamiliar voice asked for Travis and my mother. Paper rustled. The front door clicked shut. Footsteps dragged back toward the dining room, much slower this time. Travis rounded the corner. His arrogant posture was gone. His skin looked like old chalk. His hands shook as he held a thick manila envelope. The envelope slipped through his fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a loud slap. He looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. "What the hell did you just do?" "My name is Anna Garcia. I am 32 years old. I bought my 4,500 square foot estate in Madison, Mississippi, with blood, sweat, and a whole lot of black coffee. As a regional logistics director, I manage supply chains across the South. For the past decade, I worked 70-hour weeks to secure the deed to my dream home. Every single floorboard of that house belongs to me. Yet my own mother and sister sat in my dining room and tried to hand my sanctuary over to a family of grifters who had never worked a day in their lives. They assumed I would surrender, hand over my keys, and walk away quietly. They thought they held all the cards, but what was waiting for them inside that envelope made Travis literally drop to his knees. If you believe no one should ever take your hard work for granted, hit subscribe right now before we go one step further. Tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome to Grape Vengeance. None of this makes sense unless I take you back to the beginning. You need to understand how a woman gets pushed to the breaking point by her own flesh and blood. You need to see exactly why I did not shed a single tear when I pulled the rug out from under them. To understand how my own home was turned into a battleground, we have to go back 3 years. Back to the days when I thought working hard and staying quiet was enough to buy me peace. 3 years ago, my life was built on a foundation of bitter black coffee and relentless exhaustion. At 32, I worked as a regional logistics director. My job was not glamorous. I managed supply chains stretching across 5 southern states. If a freight truck broke down on a highway in Georgia at 2 in the morning, my phone rang. If a warehouse in Tennessee failed a safety inspection, I drove there to fix it. I worked 70 hours a week every single week. My eyes constantly burned from staring at spreadsheets under harsh fluorescent office lights. My social life did not exist. I traded vacations, dates, and weekends for overtime pay and corporate bonuses. Every extra dollar went straight into a dedicated savings account. I had a singular, unbending goal. I wanted to buy a sprawling estate in Madison, a place with heavy iron gates and enough distance from the city to give me peace. My mother, Helen, had a different full-time occupation. She spent her days managing the fragile ego of my 25-year-old sister. Brittany refused to fill out a single job application after graduating from high school. She declared herself a lifestyle influencer. Her chosen career consisted of sleeping until noon complaining about internet speeds and unboxing expensive cosmetics in front of a ring light. She generated zero income, but she lived like a wealthy heiress. Helen funded this delusion without hesitation. If Brittany wanted a designer handbag to feature in a video, Helen swiped her credit card. If Brittany decided she was too stressed to clean her own room, Helen folded her laundry and dusted her shelves. My mother treated my sister like royalty, catering to her every whim while treating my demanding career as a convenient ATM for the family. The true nature of our dynamic shattered my remaining patience during a sweltering family barbecue in early July. Helen hosted the gathering in her cramped backyard. The air felt thick and heavy with humidity. Uncles, aunts, and cousins crowded around folding tables, eating potato salad and swatting away mosquitoes. I stood near the wooden fence, wearing a simple linen shirt, trying to answer urgent work emails on my phone. The smell of burning charcoal drifted through the yard. Across the lawn, Helen held court. She spoke loudly, ensuring everyone could hear her praise my sister. She told Uncle David that Brittany was on the verge of signing a lucrative brand deal. She told Aunt Susan that Brittany was a creative visionary, suffering under the immense pressure of online fame. Brittany sat in a lawn chair wearing oversized sunglasses, sipping a diet soda, letting our mother do her public relations work. I put my phone in my pocket and walked inside the house to grab a bottle of cold water from the kitchen. The air conditioning offered a brief moment of relief. That relief vanished the moment Helen stepped through the sliding glass door, closely followed by Brittany. Helen did not ask how my week was going. She did not ask about the recent promotion I had earned. She walked straight up to me, crossed her arms, and held out her open palm. "Give me your keys," she said. Her tone was sharp. She used the kind of voice reserved for commanding a disobedient child. I stopped unscrewing the cap of my water bottle. I looked at her empty hand, then up to her face. I asked her why she needed my keys. Helen sighed loudly, rolling her eyes to show her annoyance. Brittany has a weekend networking trip at a lake house in Florida. She is meeting with other important creators. Her car needs new tires and the shop cannot fit her in today. She is taking your sedan for the weekend. I stared at my sister. Brittany did not even look up from her phone screen. She leaned against the kitchen counter typing a text message, fully expecting me to hand over the keys to my only vehicle. My sedan was reliable, practical, and fully paid off. More importantly, I needed it. I had a mandatory meeting at a regional distribution center the following morning. If I missed that inspection, a lucrative shipping contract would fall apart, jeopardizing months of my hard work. I tightened the plastic cap on my water bottle. I looked my mother directly in the eye and said, "No." The single word hung in the quiet kitchen. Helen blinked, her outstretched hand dropping slightly. "Excuse me," she whispered. I kept my voice even and calm. I explained my schedule. I detailed the importance of the Monday morning distribution center meeting. I suggested Brittany rent a vehicle for her trip, or perhaps Helen could lend her own car. Helen stepped closer, invading my personal space. Her face turned a deep shade of red. "You make a six-figure salary, Anna. You can afford to hire a driver for a few days. Your sister is trying to build her brand and secure her future. This trip could change her life, and you are standing in her way. Stop being so incredibly selfish." I shook my head. I slipped my hand into my pocket, wrapping my fingers tightly around my keys. I walked past them, pushing open the sliding glass door, and stepped back into the suffocating heat of the backyard. But Helen was not finished. A simple refusal was an unforgivable insult to her authority. Within 5 minutes, I watched my mother begin a calculated theatrical performance. She cornered Aunt Susan and Uncle David near the patio table. Helen pressed a paper napkin to her eyes, forcing tears to spill down her cheeks. I stood by the fence and listened to her dismantle my character piece by piece. She did not lower her voice. She wanted the entire yard to hear her tragedy. Helen cried about how difficult it was to raise a daughter who cared only about money. She claimed I was hoarding my wealth while my poor sister struggled to survive. She painted me as a cold, calculating corporate drone who actively wanted to see her own flesh and blood fail. She told our relatives that I possessed a heart of stone. Aunt Susan glared at me across the lawn, her lips pressed into a thin line of judgment. Uncle David shook his head in deep disappointment. In the past, I would have rushed over to defend myself. I would have felt the desperate need to explain the truth. I would have listed the long hours I worked, the stress of my job, and the reality of Brittany refusing to earn a single paycheck. But as I watched Helen dab her fake tears and saw Brittany smiling smugly from her lawn chair, something fundamental shifted inside my chest. A cold, hard realization settled over me. Engaging with Helen only fed the monster. She thrived on the chaos. She desperately wanted me to shout, to cry, to lose my temper so she could point her finger and call me unstable. She wanted me to argue so she could solidify her role as the long-suffering victim. Defending myself was a losing game because the jury was already rigged. Instead of fighting back, I turned around and walked out the front gate. I got into my reliable sedan, locked the doors, turned the ignition, and drove away. I left them in the backyard to whisper and judge. Their baseless opinions did not pay my mortgage. Their judgment did not fund my future. As I drove toward my small rented apartment, I stopped at a red light and pulled up my banking application. I stared at the numbers on the screen. The balance was high. I was only 3 months away from paying the cash down payment on the Madison estate. That afternoon, in the sweltering heat, I forged a new survival tactic. I chose weaponized silence. I stopped sharing my daily life with my mother. I stopped offering explanations. I stopped arguing over dinner tables. I realized that true power does not come from winning a shouting match with unreasonable people. True power comes from total financial independence. You cannot control a woman who does not need your money, your approval, or your roof. I spent the next 3 years perfecting that quiet armor. I finalized the deed to my estate. I built my sanctuary behind those heavy iron gates, pouring my energy into my career and my home. I thought keeping my distance would maintain the peace. I genuinely believed my firm boundaries would protect me from their entitlement. I was wrong. A parasite never stops looking for a host. When the money runs dry, they simply change their tactics. My sister was about to manufacture a personal crisis so severe it would breach my front doors and drag the war directly into my living room. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the peace I fought so hard to build finally cracked. I sat in my quiet living room reviewing freight manifests on my tablet. Heavy rain washed against the tall glass windows, creating a soothing rhythm. Then the iron gates at the edge of my driveway buzzed. The harsh electronic sound echoed sharply through the quiet house. I checked the security monitor mounted on the wall. My mother stood in the pouring rain next to her silver SUV. Behind her, Brittany leaned against 10 oversized bright pink suitcases. They looked like a traveling circus camped on my pristine concrete driveway. I pressed the intercom button and asked for an explanation. My mother leaned into the camera lens. She claimed Brittany's roommates locked her out and threw her things on the street. Helen spun a dramatic tale of an illegal eviction, insisting Brittany had nowhere else to go. I stared at the screen, gripping the edge of my tablet. I knew my sister's habits. She likely stopped paying her share of the rent to buy more camera equipment for a non-existent influencer career. But leaving them in a torrential downpour would only invite a neighborhood spectacle. I hit the gate release button. They dragged the wet luggage across my spotless hardwood floors. Puddles formed on the expensive Persian rugs I had imported from Turkey. Helen dropped her keys on my kitchen counter and gave me a stern, challenging look. She stated Brittany was going through a terrible trauma. She demanded a safe place for her youngest daughter to heal. She requested 2 weeks in the guest wing to let Brittany get back on her feet. I looked at Brittany. She was already busy taking a selfie in the reflection of my stainless steel refrigerator, complaining aloud about the kitchen lighting. I set my tablet down. I told them 2 weeks was the firm limit. I laid out strict boundaries. No loud music after 9. Clean up every dish you use. Do your own laundry. Stay out of my home office and my master bedroom. Helen huffed, placing a hand on her hip. She asked why I had to treat my own sister like a prison inmate. I told her it was my house and those were the rules. Brittany rolled her eyes, grabbed a pink suitcase, and dragged it down the hall toward the guest quarters, scraping the hard plastic wheels against my custom baseboards. I spent the next hour mopping up their muddy footprints. 48 hours later, corporate duty called. A major distribution hub in Atlanta experienced a severe supply chain bottleneck. As the regional director, I had to be on the ground to fix the routing errors. I packed a small carry-on bag, kissed the quiet of my home goodbye, and drove straight to the airport. For 3 grueling days, I lived on stale coffee and vending machine sandwiches. I stood on concrete warehouse floors, shouting over the roar of forklifts, untangling a logistical nightmare that threatened millions of dollars in company revenue. It was exhausting, mind-numbing labor, the exact kind of hard work that pays for a sprawling estate in Madison. During brief breaks, I tried checking my home security cameras through my phone, but the interior feeds were mysteriously offline. Brittany sent me a vague text, claiming the router needed a reboot, but she pretended she did not know how to do it. I was too busy coordinating freight schedules to argue with her over internet hardware. I pushed the suspicion aside and focused on doing my job. I flew back to Mississippi late Friday night. My muscles ached, my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I just wanted a hot shower and my own soft bed. I unlocked the front door and dropped my keys on the console table. The house was quiet, but it smelled wrong. The scent of heavy, cheap floral perfume hung in the stagnant air, masking the usual smell of cedar and clean linen. I walked up the sweeping staircase toward my private suite. The hallway lights were off. As I approached my bedroom door, my foot hit something soft. I looked down. My silk blouses, the ones I wore to executive board meetings, lay crumpled on the floor. Next to them sat a pair of my expensive leather heels, scuffed and tossed aside like discarded trash. My pulse quickened. I pushed open my bedroom door. The sight made my blood run ice cold. Brittany had taken over the room. Her pink suitcases were exploded across my white duvet. Fast food wrappers littered the mahogany nightstands, but the worst damage was on my vanity. My custom skincare products, items I saved up to buy as a reward for my promotions, were destroyed. Bottles lay tipped over, their expensive contents smeared across the marble counter. Pressed powders were crushed deep into the carpet fibers. Brittany lay in the center of my bed, wearing my expensive silk robe, casually scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in, entirely unfazed. She told me the guest room felt too cramped for her creative process. She said my room had better natural light for her morning skincare routines, so she simply moved her things upstairs. She did not ask. She just took the space. I took a deep breath, fighting the sudden urge to drag her out by the collar of that stolen robe. I demanded she pack her things and return to the guest wing immediately. Before Brittany could even open her mouth to argue, Helen marched into the room. My mother wore her pajamas, holding a steaming mug of my expensive herbal tea. She stepped between us, shielding my sister like I was a wild predator about to strike. Helen raised her voice, accusing me of lacking a basic ounce of human empathy. She said Brittany was already fragile from the terrible eviction trauma. She claimed my sister needed comfort space and a luxurious environment to heal her shattered nerves. Helen pointed a rigid finger at my chest and called me a materialistic snob for caring more about ruined makeup than my own flesh and blood. I looked at my ruined vanity. I looked at the grease stains on my pristine bedding. I looked at my mother standing tall and proud defending a thief. It was a psychological trap. If I yelled, if I threw their luggage onto the front lawn in a fit of rage, Helen would pull out her phone. She would record my anger. She would post it online or show it to every relative in the state, proving her narrative that I was a cruel, heartless monster. They wanted a screaming match. They wanted me to lose control so they could justify their eternal victimhood. I felt a cold clarity wash over my exhaustion. I refused to give them the ammunition they desperately craved. I nodded slowly. I did not speak a single word to either of them. I turned around and walked over to my closet. I pulled out 3 large duffel bags. Under their confused stares, I began packing my remaining clean work clothes, my essential corporate files, and a few sentimental items. I zipped the bags shut, hoisted them over my shoulder, and walked down the hall to the east wing. I claimed the smaller bedroom at the end of the corridor. It had a sturdy, heavy lock on the door. I brought my steel safe inside, securing my jewelry, my passports, and my financial documents. I shut the heavy wooden door and locked it from the inside. Let them have the master suite for now. Let them think they won this petty territorial battle. I knew this was not about a temporary 2-week stay. They were probing my defenses, testing how far they could push the boundaries before I snapped. They mistook my tactical retreat for weakness. But retreating gave me the perfect vantage point. From the shadows of the guest wing, I could observe every single move they made. I watched their audacity grow. I watched them treat my estate like a free luxury hotel, ordering expensive food deliveries and leaving the empty boxes on the kitchen island. I waited, keeping my mouth shut and my eyes open, because a few days later, the real invasion would begin. Brittany was not just bringing her suitcases into my home. She was about to introduce a parasite who would push my patience past the point of no return. It had been exactly 30 days since my mother stood in my foyer and declared my sister only needed 2 weeks to get back on her feet. 30 days of heavy footsteps echoing above my ceiling and loud television programs vibrating through the floorboards. The agreed deadline came and went without a single mention of an apartment search. Instead of packing her bright pink suitcases, Brittany decided to expand her territory. She brought in reinforcements. His name was Travis. At 29 years old, Travis was chronically unemployed and fiercely proud of it. He drove a lifted pickup truck with a cracked windshield and a rusted muffler that rattled the windows of my quiet neighborhood every time he turned the ignition. He claimed to be a digital entrepreneur waiting for his big break. In reality, he was a skilled grifter whose empty pockets were funded by whatever woman felt sorry enough to buy his dinner. He carried a monumental sense of entitlement, acting as if the world owed him a living just for waking up in the morning. He did not hold a job, but he treated my sister like she was lucky to have him around. He did not ask for permission to stay in my house. There was no polite introduction over dinner. There was no request to spend the weekend. One Tuesday evening, I came home from the office to find his muddy boots sitting directly on my front porch. He stayed that night. He stayed the next night. By the end of his first week, his cheap shaving cream sat on the guest bathroom counter, and his unwashed laundry overflowed into the main hallway. My pristine estate transformed into a chaotic fraternity house. While I negotiated freight contracts and managed supply chains to pay the heavy mortgage, Travis treated my home like an all-inclusive resort. I would wake up at 5 in the morning to prepare for work and find crusted cereal bowls left on the granite kitchen island. Sticky spills ruined the polish on the hardwood floors. Thick clumps of dried mud were ground deeply into the fibers of the expensive Persian rugs I had imported for the living room. Empty beer bottles gathered on the expensive leather sofa. I cleaned the messes in total silence. I wiped the counters, gathered the trash, and vacuumed the rugs before leaving for the office. I refused to give them the satisfaction of an argument. I knew complaining would only summon Helen to defend them. My mother would rush over, accuse me of being an ungracious host, and demand I show compassion for a young couple trying to build their life. I chose to protect my peace by biting my tongue and locking myself in the guest wing every evening. But my silent endurance shattered on a humid Thursday evening. I walked through the front doors after a grueling 10-hour shift at the logistics center. My feet ached and my head pounded from staring at spreadsheets all day. The heavy bass of a loud video game echoed from the main living room. The volume shook the framed artwork hanging on the walls. I set my briefcase down on the console table and walked toward the noise, intending to close the heavy wooden doors to muffle the sound. I stepped into the doorway and froze. Travis stood in the center of my formal living room. He held a black plastic trash bag open with one hand. With his other hand, he swept the contents of my built-in display shelves directly into the garbage. My eyes locked onto a very specific item tumbling into the dark plastic bag. It was a handcrafted vintage wooden watch box. The dark mahogany gleamed under the recessed ceiling lights. That box belonged to my late father. It was one of the only physical items I kept from him after his heart gave out 10 years ago. It still smelled faintly of his old cologne. It held irreplaceable memories of the man who taught me the value of hard work. Before I could even process the shock, Travis grabbed a stack of framed family photographs and tossed them in next to the heirloom. I stepped forward quickly. I reached deep into the plastic bag, pushing aside crumpled fast food wrappers, and pulled the wooden box out. I held it tightly against my chest. My knuckles turned white from the force of my grip. Travis paused. He looked at me with a blank, lazy expression. He scratched the back of his neck and let out a long sigh. He did not look embarrassed. He looked annoyed that I had interrupted his chore. He told me he needed the shelf space. He casually explained he was setting up his new gaming consoles and needed room to display his collectible action figures. He pointed at the built-in shelves, claiming the old junk sitting there was just taking up prime real estate and collecting dust. He turned his back to me and reached for another decorative ornament. He did not apologize. He did not care that he was throwing away my family history to make room for his plastic toys. He viewed my home as his personal property to alter and destroy as he saw fit. A cold fury settled deep inside my ribs. My heart pounded a steady, dangerous rhythm against my sternum. The urge to grab him by the collar of his faded shirt and drag him out the front door burned through my veins. I wanted to throw his muddy boots into the street and change the locks. But I looked at his smug posture. I heard my sister laughing loudly in the kitchen down the hall. I realized exactly what would happen if I lost my temper. If I kicked him out right now, Helen would be at my door in 10 minutes. She would call the police, she would spin frantic lies about an illegal eviction and accuse me of physical intimidation. They would paint me as the villain and drag my name through the mud. I looked dead into Travis's eyes. I saw the truth. Travis was not just a lazy boyfriend taking advantage of free rent. He was a parasite. A parasite does not negotiate with the host. A parasite consumes the host until there is nothing left. He intended to attach himself to my life, drain my financial resources, and discard my memories until he owned the entire estate. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a word of protest. I turned on my heel and carried my father's watch box down the long corridor to my secure room in the guest wing. I walked inside and locked the heavy door behind me. I set the mahogany heirloom safely on my nightstand, running my fingers over the smooth wood. Then I opened my laptop. The time for passive observation was over. The time for enduring their disrespect had ended. I opened a fresh document and began drafting a lethal exit strategy. I needed to surgically cut this infection out of my property. I planned to remove them so cleanly and efficiently they would never see the blade coming. I started researching corporate real estate laws and rapid property liquidation. I was preparing to wage a silent war, but as I typed those first few notes, I had no idea that my mother was already plotting behind my back. I was unaware that Helen was about to hand them a financial weapon that would force me to accelerate my entire timeline. Sunday afternoon arrived, draped in suffocating southern heat. I stood at the kitchen island, cutting vegetables for a roast chicken. The repetitive rhythm of the steel blade against the wooden cutting board grounded my racing thoughts. The house felt tense. Ever since I rescued my father's watch box from the trash bag, Travis and Brittany treated me like a hostile intruder in my own home. They whispered when I walked into a room. They rolled their eyes when I asked them to wash their plates. The heavy front door swung open. My mother walked inside without knocking. Helen carried a white cardboard bakery box containing a dozen cheap grocery store pastries. She set the box on the granite counter with a loud thud. She did not say hello. She did not ask how my stressful week at the logistics firm ended. She marched straight to the coffee maker, poured herself a mug, and turned to face me. Her posture was rigid, her jaw set in a firm line. "We need to talk about your attitude," Helen said. I kept slicing a red onion. I did not look up. I asked her what she meant. Helen stirred her coffee. The metal spoon clinked loudly against the ceramic mug. She told me Travis felt alienated. She claimed my behavior the other night was hostile and uncalled for. According to my mother, Travis was simply trying to organize the living room to create a better environment for everyone. She spun a ridiculous narrative where pulling a precious family heirloom out of the garbage was an act of bullying. "He is a guest under your roof," Helen stated. "You made him feel like a criminal over a dusty old box. I expect you to apologize to him before dinner." I set the chef's knife down. The cold steel rested against the warm wood. I looked into my mother's eyes. I saw zero empathy. I saw only a desperate need to maintain control. She wanted me to bow my head and beg forgiveness from a lazy grifter who respected nothing. I told her I would never apologize for protecting my own property. Helen scoffed. She opened her mouth to launch into another theatrical lecture about my selfish nature. I needed air before I lost my temper. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and walked out the back door. I marched down the long concrete driveway toward the brick mailbox near the iron gates. The sun beat down on my shoulders. I pulled a stack of envelopes from the metal box, bills, advertisements, and a thick envelope bearing the logo of my primary bank. I frowned. I handled all my corporate and personal finances online. I never received paper statements unless an account triggered a severe security flag. I slid my finger under the paper flap and tore it open. I unfolded the thick white paper. My eyes scanned the black ink. It was a statement for a specific platinum credit card. I kept this exact card hidden in a false bottom drawer near the kitchen sink. It was strictly an emergency lifeline. I reserved it for sudden medical crises or catastrophic home repairs. I had not touched the plastic in over 2 years. The current balance read $3,200. My breath caught in my throat. I read the itemized charges. The transactions all took place 3 days ago at a high-end electronics and camera retailer in downtown Jackson. Someone purchased professional studio lighting rigs, high-capacity digital storage drives, and a cinematic camera lens. The paper trembled in my hands. The heat rising from the asphalt driveway suddenly felt suffocating. Someone had rummaged through my private drawers, stolen my financial lifeline, and maxed out the limit on luxury toys. I walked back up the driveway. My steps were heavy and deliberate. I pushed open the back door and stepped into the air-conditioned kitchen. Helen was still leaning against the counter, eating a pastry. Travis and Brittany sat in the adjacent living room. Travis wore a brand new designer graphic shirt. Brittany held a sleek, expensive digital camera, pointing the lens toward the window to test the natural light. They laughed together, completely carefree. I walked to the kitchen island and slapped the bank statement onto the granite. The sharp sound made Helen jump. She dropped her pastry. I demanded to know who went into my private drawer. Travis and Brittany froze in the living room. They slowly turned their heads toward the kitchen. Brittany lowered the expensive camera. She looked at our mother, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Helen did not flinch. She brushed the pastry crumbs from her blouse. She picked up her coffee mug and took a slow, casual sip. Her calm demeanor chilled my blood faster than the air conditioning. I gave them the card, Helen said. Her voice lacked any trace of guilt. She spoke as if she had simply lent them a cup of sugar. I stared at her. I asked her to repeat herself, hoping I misunderstood the sheer audacity of her words. Helen sighed, treating my shock like a childish tantrum. She explained that Travis needed professional equipment to launch his new streaming channel. She called it a critical business startup investment. She claimed Brittany's influencer career was stalling because they lacked the proper production value. You were at work, Helen explained smoothly. They found the perfect camera gear on sale. We knew you would want to support your sister's future. I took the card from the drawer. It is a family investment, Anna. When their channel takes off, they will pay you back with interest. I looked at the itemized bill. $3,000, stolen by my own mother to fund a delusional hobby for a man who did not even have the dignity to pay for his own groceries. I asked Helen how she could justify stealing from her own daughter. Helen slammed her coffee mug down. The dark liquid splashed onto the counter. She pointed a rigid finger at my chest. Do not use that word with me, Helen hissed. I am your mother. I raised you. You sit in this giant mansion earning a 6-figure salary while your sister struggles to survive. You have thousands of dollars sitting in retirement accounts doing nothing. You are hoarding wealth. Family shares their blessings. You should be proud to help Travis build his empire. She was gaslighting me in broad daylight. She twisted clear financial theft into a moral obligation. She expected me to swallow the debt smile and thank them for the opportunity to fund their laziness. I did not argue. I did not scream about the betrayal. The time for reasoning with these people was dead and buried. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened my banking application. What are you doing? Helen demanded. I navigated to the emergency card account. With 3 swift taps, I froze the credit line. I flagged the recent transactions as fraudulent and reported the physical plastic card as stolen. Brittany rushed into the kitchen, clutching the camera to her chest. You cannot do that, she whined. We need to buy microphones tomorrow. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked at Brittany, then at Travis, and finally at Helen. The card is dead, I said. You owe me $3,000. If the money is not in my account by Friday, I am filing a formal police report for credit card theft. Helen gasped. She clutched the fabric of her blouse, her face turning a deep shade of purple. She called me a tyrant. She called me a heartless, greedy monster who cared more about pieces of paper than her own blood. She wrapped her arms around Brittany, shielding her from my cold stare, whispering that I was out of my mind. I turned my back on them and walked down the hallway toward the guest wing. As I locked my heavy bedroom door, a profound psychological shift occurred inside my chest. The last lingering shred of daughterly guilt evaporated. For years, I tolerated Helen's manipulation because society dictates we must honor our parents. I endured the insults because I thought deep down she still loved me. The credit card statement proved otherwise. Helen was not just a protective mother enabling a lazy child. She was an active predator. She orchestrated the theft of my hard-earned wealth. She handed my financial security over to a grifter without a second thought. She viewed my success as a communal asset meant to be plundered. The gloves were officially off. My conscience was clear. I sat at my small desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up the encrypted emails from Thomas, the ruthless corporate real estate attorney I contacted earlier in the week. The plan to liquidate the estate was no longer just a desperate fantasy. It was an absolute necessity. I needed to cut the cancer out of my life permanently. I began drafting my formal requirements for the property sale. I requested an all-cash buyer. I demanded total secrecy until the final documents were signed. I wanted a corporate entity that would show zero mercy when it came time to clear the premises. I sat in the quiet room, typing my exit strategy, listening to the muffled sounds of Helen consoling Travis and Brittany down the hall. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought stealing my money was their greatest victory. They had no idea they just handed me the moral authority to destroy their entire world. But the parasites were not finished testing my limits. My mother's theft was a brutal betrayal, but the true physical destruction of my sanctuary was only days away. They were about to cross a boundary so severe it would force me to pull the trigger on the real estate deal faster than I ever anticipated. Tuesday afternoon brought a different kind of heat to Mississippi. The air felt heavy, thick with humidity and the smell of impending rain. I drove my sedan away from the logistics corporate office, my mind focused on a delayed freight shipment in Memphis. I needed a quiet space. I needed to sit at my mahogany desk, pull up my dual monitors, and reroute 36 delivery trucks before the evening deadline. My home office was my sanctuary. It was the only room in the estate where I felt truly insulated from the chaos my mother and sister brought into my life. I turned onto my street and approached the heavy iron gates of my property. As the metal doors swung open, I tapped my brakes. A rusted white cargo van sat parked on my pristine concrete driveway, right next to Travis's loud pickup truck. The van lacked license plates on the front. Dark oil dripped from its undercarriage, staining the gray stone. My pulse quickened. I did not authorize any maintenance work. I did not schedule any deliveries. I parked my car in the garage, grabbed my briefcase, and unlocked the side entrance. The moment I stepped into the hallway, a harsh, rhythmic sound echoed through the house. It was not the heavy bass of a video game or the high pitch of a television show. It was the unmistakable sound of metal striking solid wood, followed by the sickening crunch of breaking drywall. A thick cloud of white plaster dust drifted down the corridor, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. The air smelled of raw pine and pulverized chalk. I dropped my briefcase on the floor. I walked toward the noise, my low heels clicking against the hardwood, my chest tightening with every step. The sound led me straight to the double doors of my private home office. I pushed the doors open and stopped breathing. Two strange men in dirty work boots and stained undershirts stood inside my sanctuary. One man held a heavy pry bar, ripping the custom baseboards away from the wall. But the true horror stood in the center of the room. Travis held a long steel sledgehammer. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He swung the heavy tool backward and slammed it directly into my built-in mahogany bookshelves. The dark wood splintered. Deep cracks shot through the expensive shelves I had paid for with the bonus from my very first regional director promotion. In the corner of the room, my metal filing cabinets lay tipped over, their drawers dented and forced open. Years of hard-earned corporate records, tax documents, and personal files were scattered across the floor, covered in a thick layer of white dust. Near the window, Brittany stood, holding her expensive digital camera, the one she bought with my stolen credit card. She pointed the lens at Travis, recording the destruction with a bright, enthusiastic smile. Travis lowered the sledgehammer and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He noticed me standing in the doorway. He did not drop the tool. He did not look ashamed. He smiled, puffing out his chest, leaning the heavy hammer against his leg. He told me I was home early. I stared at the jagged shards of mahogany covering my rug. I tasted the dry, bitter plaster dust on my tongue. I looked at the two unvetted strangers tracking mud onto my floors. Travis casually gestured around the ruined room. He explained that the house had too much wasted square footage. He said my old desk and dusty books were taking up prime real estate. According to him, their new streaming channel required a professional background. They were gutting my office to create an open-concept content creator studio. He spoke with supreme arrogance, as if he were doing me a favor by destroying the very room that paid the mortgage. Brittany lowered her camera and chimed in, complaining that the dark wood of my shelves ruined her lighting for makeup tutorials. She said white walls and neon signs would bring in better sponsorships. They expected an explosion. They wanted me to scream to cry over the broken wood, to throw a tantrum they could record and manipulate. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over my mind. The anger evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. I did not raise my voice at my sister. I did not acknowledge the arrogant grifter holding the hammer. I turned my eyes to the two hired workers. They shifted uncomfortably under my stare, lowering their tools. I spoke in a low, even tone. I told them they were trespassing on private property. I instructed them to pack their tools and walk out the front door within 60 seconds, or I would press charges for breaking and entering. The men looked at Travis, then looked back at my face. They recognized the quiet danger in my voice. They dropped the pry bar, grabbed their canvas tool bags, and hurried past me into the hallway, eager to escape the tension. Travis stepped forward, his face turning red. He raised his voice, demanding to know why I was ruining his project. He told me I had no right to kick his crew out. I did not answer him. I did not look at him. I simply turned my back, walked down the hallway, and picked up my briefcase. I walked out the side door and got back into my sedan. I locked the doors, turned the ignition, and blasted the air conditioning to clear the smell of plaster dust from my nose. I backed out of the driveway, leaving the white van and the grifters behind. I did not drive back to the logistics firm. I drove straight into downtown Jackson. The tall glass buildings reflected the harsh afternoon sun. I pulled into a private underground parking garage, took the private elevator to the top floor, and stepped into a high-end corporate law firm. The receptionist recognized me immediately and waved me through the double-glass doors. Thomas sat behind a massive, polished desk. He was a ruthless corporate real estate attorney, a man who dismantled lives and liquidated assets with surgical precision. He wore a sharp-tailored suit and possessed a demeanor as cold as ice. He did not waste time with small talk. I sat down in the leather chair across from him. I opened my briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy folder containing the original deed to my Madison estate. I placed the document on the center of his glass desk and slid it forward. Thomas looked at the paperwork, then looked up at my face. He noticed the white drywall dust clinging to the sleeves of my dark blazer. I issued a single, ironclad directive. "Liquidate the estate immediately," I said. "Leave them with nothing." Thomas picked up a silver pen. He opened the folder and reviewed the legal seals. He confirmed that my name was the only one on the title. He asked if I wanted to initiate a standard residential eviction. I shook my head. A standard eviction meant court's notices and months of drawn-out battles, where Helen would play the victim. I wanted a corporate buyout. I wanted a faceless, multi-billion-dollar entity to take possession of the land. I wanted the buyers to handle the removal of the occupants with zero mercy. Thomas nodded slowly. He told me he knew a commercial management group looking to acquire large, secluded properties in Madison for corporate retreats. They paid in cash, and they closed fast. He warned me the process would require intense secrecy. He advised me to go back to the house, pack my valuables, and act as if nothing had changed. He told me to smile, to nod, and to let them think they had won the war over the home office. Then Thomas leaned forward. He tapped his pen against the glass desk. He told me that during a rapid corporate sale, the buyers often require an assessment of the current occupants to prepare their security teams. He instructed me to monitor my home security feeds closely over the next few days. He said grifters always get sloppy when they think they have the upper hand, and capturing their true intentions on camera would make the corporate handover seamless. I left the law firm with my chest feeling lighter than it had in years. The trap was set. but as I drove back toward my ruined sanctuary, I did not realize that Travis and Helen were already taking Thomas's prediction to heart. They were getting sloppy, and later that night, my patio security camera would capture a conversation so twisted and sinister, it would prove exactly why selling my home was the only way to survive. I drove back to my estate with a tight grip on the steering wheel. Thomas had given me strict instructions to play the part of a defeated daughter. I needed to act normal, pack my valuables quietly, and let the intruders believe they had won the war over my home office. When I pulled through the iron gates, the white cargo van was gone. The harsh Mississippi afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. I parked my sedan in the garage and took a deep breath. Walking back into the house required every ounce of discipline I possessed. I passed the shattered mahogany remnants of my sanctuary. The white plaster dust still coated the hardwood floor. Brittany sat at the kitchen island, complaining loudly about the internet speed lagging, while she tried to upload a makeup tutorial. I did not say a word. I poured myself a glass of ice water, kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, and walked down the long corridor to my secured room in the east wing. I locked the heavy wooden door, opened my closet, and began quietly sorting my essential corporate documents and sentimental jewelry into a discreet duffel bag. I waited for the house to fall asleep. It was past midnight when the heavy silence finally settled over the property. The glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark bedroom as I reviewed the encrypted emails from Thomas. We were compiling a list of target commercial buyers. My phone sat on the nightstand. Suddenly, the screen illuminated with a silent notification. Motion detected on the rear patio camera. I reached for the device and opened the security application. The night vision lens displayed a crisp, high-definition image of the stone fire pit in my backyard. Two figures lounged in the expensive padded chairs I had imported from Italy, my mother and Travis. I tapped the speaker icon. The live audio feed crackled, picking up the ambient sound of crickets and the low hiss of the gas fire pit. Then I heard the distinct clink of crystal glasses. Travis leaned forward and poured a dark liquid from a familiar bottle. My stomach turned. It was a rare vintage Cabernet I had saved to celebrate my eventual promotion to regional vice president. He filled his glass to the brim, then poured a generous amount for Helen. They clinked their glasses together and laughed softly into the warm night air. Then the tone of their conversation shifted. Travis set his glass on the stone table and picked up a glowing electronic tablet. He swiped the screen, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light. He told my mother he had been doing some serious research while I was away at work. He started reading aloud from a legal website. He outlined the specific tenets of Mississippi tenancy laws. He explained that because he had been receiving his credit card bills and online shopping packages at my address for the past month, he had legally established permanent residency. He spoke with a smug, calculated pride. He told Helen that I could not simply call the police to throw him out. He knew the authorities would deem it a civil matter. I would have to serve him with a formal eviction notice, a process he proudly claimed he could drag out in the court system for 6 to 8 months. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, listening to a grifter map out the legal theft of my property. But Travis was only laying the groundwork. My mother was the one who supplied the real poison. Helen took a slow sip of my expensive wine. She told Travis not to worry about the formal eviction timeline. She leaned closer to the fire, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She offered to help him manufacture a fake lease agreement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned the volume up on my phone, pressing the speaker close to my ear. Helen promised to draft a document stating I had rented the entire guest wing to Travis and Brittany for a fixed 2-year term, backdated to the exact day Brittany arrived with her pink suitcases. She bragged about knowing my handwriting intimately. She assured Travis she could forge my signature so perfectly that no standard civil court judge would ever question its authenticity. Travis grinned, resting his boots on the edge of the fire pit. He asked her what would happen if I hired an aggressive lawyer and took the forged lease to a higher court. Helen did not hesitate. Her response chilled the blood in my veins. She stated she would gladly testify against me. She planned to look a judge in the eye and swear under oath that her oldest daughter was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She told Travis I was overworked, paranoid, and cracking under the pressure of my corporate logistics career. She intended to argue that my refusal to share my wealth was a symptom of extreme emotional instability. Her ultimate goal was staggering. Helen outlined a strategy to petition the local court for a temporary guardianship. She wanted to declare me emotionally unfit to manage my own physical and financial assets. If a judge granted that petition even temporarily, Helen would gain legal control of my estate, my bank accounts, and my future. She would use that power to grant Travis and Brittany permanent residence, effectively locking me out of the empire I spent a decade building. I lowered the phone from my ear. The audio continued to play, capturing their laughter as they toasted to their brilliant strategy. The shattered bookshelves in my office were petty vandalism. The stolen credit card was a crime of opportunity. But this conversation on the patio was a formal declaration of legal war. My own mother was plotting to institutionalize me. She was willing to destroy my sanity, jeopardize my high-level corporate career, and freeze my hard-earned assets, all to secure a free luxury lifestyle for a lazy parasite who refused to earn an honest paycheck. The betrayal was so profound, it bypassed anger and settled into a state of razor-sharp clarity. Any lingering doubts I had about selling the family home vanished into the dark Mississippi night. I pressed the record button on my security application. I captured every single word of their conspiracy, saving the high-definition video and audio files directly to a secure, encrypted cloud drive. They thought they were operating in the shadows, crafting a foolproof plan to steal my life. Instead, they had just handed me the exact leverage Thomas requested. I closed the application and opened my text messages. I typed a brief, decisive message to my attorney. I told Thomas I had the evidence. I instructed him to accelerate the timeline immediately. I authorized him to accept whatever cash discount the corporate buyers demanded, as long as the closing happened within days instead of weeks. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the nightstand, and looked around my quiet room. The minor conflict of a crowded house had transformed into a fight for my fundamental freedom. If Helen succeeded in filing a guardianship petition, I could lose my job. A logistics director managing millions in freight could not have a public record of mental instability. She was playing a lethal game with my livelihood. But Helen made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed I would fight her in a courtroom, screaming and defending my sanity, while she played the calm, concerned mother. She expected a drawn-out residential battle where she could manipulate the narrative. She did not realize I was already holding the nuclear launch keys. I was not going to fight an eviction battle. I was going to erase the battlefield entirely. As I laid back on my pillows and stared at the dark ceiling, I felt a deep sense of peace. The corporate machine was waking up. Thomas was preparing the final strike. The secret counterattack was fully in motion, and the grifters sleeping under my roof had absolutely no idea the ground was about to vanish beneath their feet. The sun broke over the Mississippi tree line, casting long shadows across my bedroom floor. I had not slept a single minute. My phone vibrated on the nightstand right at dawn. A brief, encrypted message from Thomas lit up the screen. He reviewed the patio recording. The audio files were pristine. We had the leverage. He told me to come to his downtown office at noon. I threw off the covers and walked into my master bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Today required the performance of a lifetime. I needed to act like a woman drowning in stress, oblivious to the predators circling her life. I pulled a sharp charcoal blazer from my closet, the kind of armor I wore to high-stakes corporate negotiations. Walking down the hallway, the smell of frying bacon drifted from the kitchen. Travis stood at my stove using my expensive copper pan to cook his breakfast. He wore a stained undershirt and gym shorts. My mother sat at the kitchen island, sipping her morning coffee. She gave me a sweet, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning, Anna," Helen chirped. "You look exhausted. Are you working too hard again?" The subtext was glaring. She was already laying the groundwork for her fake mental instability narrative, testing her script right to my face. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let out a heavy, tired sigh and poured myself a cup of black coffee. "Just another long day ahead," I murmured. "So many supply chain issues to fix. I do not know how much more of this I can take." Helen exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Travis. They thought I was breaking. They believed their psychological warfare was working flawlessly. I grabbed my travel mug, offered a weak wave, and walked out the door. The moment I started my sedan, my posture straightened. The act was over. I had a house to sell. At precisely noon, I stepped off the private elevator into Thomas's law firm. The reception area was quiet, filled with the scent of polished wood and expensive leather. Thomas waited for me inside his corner office. He did not offer small talk. He pointed to a thick stack of legal documents resting in the center of his glass desk. He found our buyer. Thomas explained the strategy with surgical precision. Traditional real estate sales were dangerous for my situation. If we listed the estate on the open market, real estate agents would want to host open houses. Appraisers would walk through the rooms, taking photographs. Home inspectors would poke around the foundation. All of those standard procedures would instantly alert Helen and Travis that the property was changing hands. They would panic. They would accelerate their forged lease and file their guardianship petition before I could close the deal. We needed a ghost transaction, a sale so quiet and fast that the squatters would wake up one morning and find themselves standing on someone else's soil. Thomas contacted a firm called Vanguard Management Group. They were a commercial entity searching for secluded luxury properties in the South to convert into private executive retreat centers. They had deep pockets and a ruthless legal department. Vanguard loved the location of my estate, but they needed an incentive to bypass their usual lengthy due diligence process. Thomas negotiated an aggressive compromise. I agreed to sell the property at a 15% discount below market value. In the world of high-end real estate, that was a significant financial hit. But I was not just selling bricks and mortar. I was buying my freedom, and freedom comes with a heavy price tag. In exchange for the steep discount, Vanguard agreed to an all-cash purchase with a 5-day closing window. They waived the appraisal, they waived the structural inspections. Most importantly, they accepted the estate under a strict as-is clause. Thomas leaned across the desk, tapping a silver pen against the contract. He explained exactly what as-is meant in this specific context. Vanguard was purchasing the physical land and the structures upon it inheriting all current conditions. Because I was the sole name on the deed and no legal lease existed on record, Vanguard would take physical possession of a commercial asset. The moment the ink dried, the estate ceased to be a residential family home. It became corporate property. If Helen and Travis tried to present their forged, backdated lease to Vanguard, it would be worse than useless. A commercial corporation does not honor handwritten residential agreements that suddenly appear after a closing date. Vanguard employed a private security force and retained a legion of litigators. They would not waste time filing civil eviction notices. They would treat the unauthorized occupants as criminal trespassers on a corporate job site. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver washed over me. By transferring the title to Vanguard, I removed myself from the battlefield entirely. Helen could not accuse me of an illegal eviction if I was no longer the landlord. She could not petition a judge to freeze my real estate assets if those assets no longer belonged to me. I picked up the silver pen. The metal felt cool against my fingers. Thomas flipped the pages, exposing the signature lines one by one. I pressed the tip of the pen to the thick parchment. The scratch of the ink was the only sound in the room. I signed my name. Then I signed it again. Every stroke of the pen severed a tie to the toxic dynamic that had suffocated me for years. I signed away the custom kitchen where my mother orchestrated her theft. I signed away the shattered mahogany home office where Travis swung his sledgehammer. I signed away the formal dining room where they smirked and plotted to lock me away. 32 signatures, 32 permanent legal declarations that the war was over. When I reached the final page, Thomas gathered the stack of documents. He struck his notary stamp against the paper, cementing the transaction into law. He typed a quick series of commands into his secure terminal. We sat in silence for 3 agonizing minutes. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened my banking application. A new notification flashed across the screen. An international wire transfer had just cleared. The discounted all-cash purchase price landed safely in my private offshore investment account. The funds were secured, hidden behind layers of corporate banking privacy, far beyond the reach of any frivolous civil lawsuit Helen might try to file in the future. It was done. I stood up and shook Thomas's hand. As I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, a strange, weightless sensation settled in my chest. As far as the state of Mississippi was concerned, Anna Garcia was officially homeless. The sprawling mansion behind the heavy iron gates belonged to a faceless corporate machine. I drove back to Madison under the blazing afternoon sun. Travis's loud pickup truck sat in the driveway leaking oil onto concrete that I no longer owned. I unlocked the side door and stepped into the hallway. The air conditioning rushed over my face. From the living room, I heard the loud, obnoxious sounds of Travis playing a violent video game. Brittany laughed at something he said. The smell of cheap takeout food lingered in the air. They were so comfortable. They were so incredibly arrogant. They thought they had successfully conquered my castle. They believed their forged documents and sinister plots were foolproof. They had no idea they were sitting inside a ticking time bomb. The trap was armed. The legal fuse was lit. But I knew Vanguard's operational team needed a few days to process the paperwork and mobilize their security division to claim the property. Until the corporate hammer fell, I had to play my part. I had to convince my mother and the grifters that I was a broken, defeated woman preparing to surrender. I needed to pack my life into boxes right in front of their eyes, feeding their massive egos, ensuring they never suspected the devastating reality rushing toward their front door. The morning after I signed the Vanguard contract, I walked into my kitchen and found a fresh disaster. The smell of stale beer and greasy pizza boxes hung in the stagnant air. Travis sat at the granite island, scrolling through social media on his phone. A puddle of spilled milk slowly dripped off the counter, pooling onto the hardwood floor near his bare feet. In the past, I would have demanded he clean his mess. I would have laid down strict rules about respecting the property. Today, I pulled a paper towel from the roll, knelt down, and wiped the floor myself. Travis did not even look up from his glowing screen. He just smirked, a self-satisfied curve forming on his lips. He thought he broke my spirit. He believed his psychological warfare had finally crushed my defenses. I threw the wet paper towel into the trash bin, washed my hands, and asked in a soft voice if he needed anything from the grocery store. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. Then his arrogance returned full force. He ordered thick imported steaks and expensive craft beer for his dinner. I nodded quietly, grabbed my leather purse, and walked out the door to fulfill his ridiculous request. Later that same afternoon, my mother dropped by unannounced. She found me sitting in the formal dining room, wrapping my expensive crystal vases in thick bubble wrap. Helen frowned, crossing her arms over her chest, and demanded to know what I was doing. I kept my head down, forcing my shoulders to slump in a posture of total defeat. I told her the house felt too crowded. I said Brittany and Travis needed more space for their heavy camera equipment. I claimed I was embracing a minimalist lifestyle to reduce my daily corporate stress. Helen's eyes lit up with sheer triumph. She bought the lie instantly. The next day, she brought 2 of her wealthy country club friends over for a midday lunch. I played the role of the dutiful, broken host. I served them sweet iced tea on the back patio. The air was thick with humidity and the overpowering scent of their expensive floral perfumes. Helen spoke loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the yard, so I would hear every single word. She bragged to her friends that she finally taught her stubborn, career-obsessed daughter the true meaning of family loyalty. She pointed toward the empty shelves in the formal living room and proudly announced I was clearing out my old junk to support Travis's new streaming business. The country club ladies gave me pitying smiles, whispering behind their manicured hands about my sudden change of heart. I just poured more tea, listening to the ice cubes clink against the glass. I swallowed the bitter humiliation because I knew a secret they did not. I knew the exact date and time the corporate security team was arriving. Let Helen gloat. Her social empire was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was rapidly approaching. My real work happened in the dead of night, when the house fell silent and the grifters were fast asleep in my beds. I moved through the halls like a ghost. I packed the items Vanguard would not care about, the sentimental things my family would either steal or pawn. I boxed up my original oil paintings. I secured my grandmother's silver flatware inside heavy canvas bags. I wrapped my corporate awards and logistics plaques in thick blankets. I carried heavy plastic bins out the side door, loading them quietly into the trunk of my sedan. I drove across town to a secure, climate-controlled storage unit. I made 3 separate trips every single night. The physical labor exhausted my muscles. My hands ached from gripping the heavy steering wheel under the yellow glow of the streetlights. But every box leaving the estate brought me one step closer to freedom. The heavy click of the metal padlock on my storage unit sounded like a victory bell. By Friday morning, the house looked barren. The walls echoed. The expensive decor that once defined my success was safely locked away behind a steel door. Travis interpreted the empty spaces as his expanding empire. At noon on Friday, he strutted through the downstairs hallway, wearing a plush white bathrobe he found deep inside my linen closet. He left wet footprints across the pristine floors. He sat on my expensive leather sofa, propped his bare feet on the glass coffee table, and turned the television volume to the maximum level. The loud action movie rattled the empty picture frames leaning against the wall. I walked past him holding a plastic laundry basket. He snapped his fingers at me, pointing toward the kitchen, demanding a fresh glass of ice water. I filled a glass and handed it to him without a single word of protest. His arrogant laughter echoed through the empty room as he snatched the drink from my hand. He truly believed he was the king of the castle. He thought he had conquered a successful corporate director without breaking a sweat. The dramatic irony was almost too sweet to bear. Vanguard Management Group officially took possession in exactly 48 hours. Their legal department was processing the final wire transfers. Their asset recovery team was already reviewing the blueprints of the estate to plan their entry. I just needed to maintain the illusion for 2 more days. I just needed to keep my mouth shut and let them celebrate their imagined dominance. But grifters always push for more. They mistake silent surrender for an open invitation to take everything you own. They never know when to stop taking, and that fatal flaw always leads them straight into the trap. Friday evening arrived with a heavy thunderstorm rolling across the Mississippi skyline. Rain lashed against the tall glass windows. Helen called a mandatory family meeting. I sat at the long dining table surrounded by the glaring empty spaces where my expensive art used to hang. Helen stood at the head of the table. She clapped her hands together, her face glowing with raw greed. She looked directly at me and prepared to deliver the final crushing blow. She announced that Travis's parents, Gary and Brenda, had just finalized the sale of their modular home down south. They were packing a rented truck as we spoke. They needed the rest of the guest wing, and they were arriving on Sunday. The demand hung in the tense air, followed by a loud crack of thunder outside. This was the moment she planned to force me out of my own home. This was the final step in their calculated takeover. I looked at Travis, who sat there grinning, confident that his parents were about to move into a luxury mansion for free. I looked at my sister, who was already browsing online for new furniture using her phone. And I looked at my mother, who stood tall, waiting for me to break down, cry, and finally pack my own bags. Instead, I reached for my glass of sweet tea. I took a slow sip, set the crystal down on the oak wood, and prepared to watch their entire world burn. The air inside the dining room felt heavy and thick with the smell of rosemary and roasted beef. Sunday evening had arrived, bringing an artificial calm before the storm. I pulled the heavy ceramic platter from the oven, placing the massive pot roast onto the center of the wooden table. I arranged roasted carrots and potatoes around the meat, treating the meal with the precise care of a chef preparing a final feast. The table was completely cleared of my personal items, leaving a sterile, impersonal surface that felt more like a hotel dining hall than a family home. Brittany sat near the head of the table, her phone propped against a water glass, as she filmed her reaction to a skincare product. She did not look up when I set the platter down. Travis lounged in his chair, wearing a clean shirt for once, though his posture remained as lazy and entitled as ever. He reached across the table with his bare fingers, snatching a piece of roasted potato before anyone else could take a plate. I did not scold him. I simply stepped back, took my seat at the far end of the long table, and waited for my mother to make her move. Helen arrived precisely at 6 o'clock. She swept through the front doors like a queen inspecting her conquered territory. She wore a tailored floral dress and her favorite pearl necklace, dressing up for an occasion she believed would cement her absolute victory over my life. She took her seat at the opposite end of the table, casting a brief critical glance at the roast before offering a tight, patronizing smile. We ate in relative silence for the first 10 minutes, broken only by the sound of silverware scraping against china, and Brittany chatting loudly into her phone microphone about lifestyle branding. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, cutting my meat into small, even pieces. I felt the profound weight of the silence, knowing it was the last quiet moment these parasites would ever experience under this roof. Halfway through the meal, Helen set her fork down with a deliberate, sharp clink against her plate. She cleared her throat, lifting her crystal wine glass in her right hand. She tapped the side of the glass with her fingernail, producing a clear, ringing tone that commanded the attention of the entire room. Brittany paused her video recording and looked up, a bright, eager grin spreading across her face. Travis stopped chewing, leaning forward with an expression of smug anticipation. They knew what was coming. This was the moment the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Helen looked down the length of the table, her eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding, cruel satisfaction. She wanted everyone to witness my formal subjugation. "I want to make an announcement regarding our living arrangements." Helen began, her voice carrying a theatrical clarity designed for an audience, as everyone here already knows. Brittany and Travis have settled into this home wonderfully. They have brought life and warmth back into these empty halls. But a young family needs room to grow, and true family supports one another without hesitation. She took a slow sip of wine, savoring the dramatic pause. Earlier today, Gary and Brenda finalized the sale of their modular home down in the southern part of the state. Helen continued, her tone swelling with pride. They have packed every single box and loaded their belongings into a moving truck. Tomorrow morning, Travis's parents are officially moving into the remaining bedrooms on the east wing to join us full-time. The declaration hung in the warm air like a physical blow. Brittany clapped her hands together in pure delight, praising our mother for finding such a wonderful solution to the housing crisis. Travis leaned back in his custom leather chair, crossing his arms behind his head, radiating the unbearable arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully stolen a multi-million-dollar estate without spending a single dime. Helen turned her gaze back to me, her chin lifting defiantly. She delivered the final, crushing ultimatum she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times. "Of course, 4 adults and a young couple require plenty of space," Helen stated, her voice dropping into a cold, transactional register. "We need the east wing entirely cleared out. If you have a problem sharing your roof with Travis's family, or if you find yourself feeling too crowded by our presence, you are more than welcome to pack your remaining bags and move out of your own house tonight." There it was. The ultimate eviction, the final demand designed to push me out into the street while my family celebrated their total triumph. They sat there grinning, waiting for my voice to crack. They anticipated the tears, the desperate begging, the furious shouting match that would prove I was unstable and unfit. I did not raise my voice, I did not panic, I simply reached for my crystal glass of iced sweet tea. I lifted it to my lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the polished wood. I looked straight into my mother's eyes, smiled, and nodded. Helen blinked, her triumphant expression faltering for a brief second. My calm acceptance threw off her entire script. She expected resistance, not a serene smile. Before she could demand an explanation for my strange composure, a sharp, authoritative sound echoed through the grand foyer. 3 heavy knocks slammed against the mahogany front door. The noise was loud enough to vibrate through the floorboards. Brittany jumped in her seat, dropping her phone onto the table. Helen frowned, annoyance flashing across her features as her carefully orchestrated moment was interrupted. Travis let out a loud groan, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. "That must be the food delivery I ordered an hour ago," Travis muttered, pushing his chair back from the table. He stood up, smoothing down his clean shirt, clearly eager to show off his domain to whoever stood on the porch. He sauntered down the hallway toward the foyer, his heavy footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. We heard the heavy brass handle turn. The front door creaked open, revealing the warm evening light outside. "Travis Garcia," a deep, unfamiliar voice demanded from the hallway. "Yep, that is me," Travis replied, his tone dripping with lazy arrogance. "What took you so long with the order? You have been served." The sound of thick paper rustling cut through the heavy silence of the dining room. Travis let out a confused laugh, asking what kind of game the delivery driver was playing. "Step aside, sir," the stranger's voice commanded, professional and entirely devoid of emotion. Heavy footsteps marched past the foyer and directly onto the hardwood floor of the main corridor. Travis stumbled backward into the dining room doorway, his face instantly draining of all color. He looked down at his hands like he was holding a venomous snake. The document did not smell like pizza boxes. It did not contain a receipt for takeout food. It was a thick legal packet bound by a heavy blue cover stamped with the official seal of a corporate legal division. Travis's hands shook so violently the paper slipped from his grip. They fluttered through the air and landed with a soft slap against the polished dining room floor right next to my chair. Brittany stood up abruptly, knocking her water glass over. The liquid spilled across the table, soaking the linen napkins, but nobody cared. She rushed toward the doorway, grabbing Travis by the arm. "Babe, what is that? What is going on?" she demanded, her voice rising in sudden panic. Travis could not speak. His jaw hung open. He pointed a trembling finger down at the white paper resting on the floor. Helen pushed her chair back, standing up with a harsh screech against the floorboards. She marched down the length of the table, her face twisting in fury as she looked at her prospective son-in-law, standing there paralyzed like a ghost. "Pick that up right now," Helen snapped, pointing at the papers. "What nonsense is this?" Travis dropped to his knees. His fingers clawed at the pages, his eyes scanning the bold, unyielding print at the top of the document. He read the first few lines aloud, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak of utter disbelief. "Notice of corporate trespass," Travis whispered, his eyes darting frantically across the page. "Eviction order, Vanguard Management Group." Helen stopped dead in her tracks. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs lazily, watching the color drain from every face at the table. "What does that mean?" Brittany screamed, dropping to her knees next to Travis, snatching a page from his trembling hands. "Read it. What does it say?" Travis swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He looked up at Helen, then turned his terrified eyes toward me. It says the property was legally acquired 3 days ago by a commercial real estate corporation," Travis stammered, tears springing to his eyes. "It says all residential titles are void. It says we have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. If we are still here tomorrow at this exact time, local law enforcement and corporate security will remove us by force for criminal trespassing." The dining room fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Helen stared at the papers on the floor, her pearl necklace rising and falling with her shallow, rapid breaths. The illusion of their grand victory shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces right before their eyes. They thought they were the masters of the house, preparing to welcome more freeloaders into a stolen mansion. They had no idea the house they stood in no longer belonged to any of us. I stood up slowly from my chair. I smoothed down the fabric of my trousers, walked around the edge of the table, and looked down at my mother and my sister kneeling in the dirt and spilled water. The trap had finally sprung, and the jaws were locked tight. Helen lunged forward. Her manicured fingers snatched the blue legal folder right out of Travis's trembling hands. The crisp pages rustled loudly in the silent dining room. She held the document close to her face. Her eyes darted back and forth across the thick black text. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin looking pale and hollow under the bright chandelier lights. She flipped to the second page, tracing the official corporate seals and notarized signatures with a shaking index finger. "This is a mistake," Helen whispered. Her voice lacked its usual commanding authority. It sounded thin and frail. She looked up from the paperwork and locked her gaze on me. The shock in her expression rapidly morphed into a blinding rage. She slapped the thick packet onto the dining table, knocking over a crystal salt shaker. The tiny white grains spilled across the polished wood. "Explain this to me right now," Helen demanded. The shrill tone returned to her voice. "How dare you pull a stunt like this? You cannot sell a family home without my permission. I am your mother. You do not have the authority to put us on the street." I remained standing near my chair. I smoothed the fabric of my trousers. My heartbeat stayed slow and steady. For years, her loud voice triggered a spike of anxiety in my chest. Tonight, it sounded like a distant echo of a defeated enemy. I looked directly into her furious eyes. My voice came out dangerously calm and utterly devoid of emotion. "It was never your home, Mom," I said. "It was mine. Every brick, every floorboard, every mortgage payment. And now it belongs to Vanguard Management Group." Helen stepped around the table, her fists clenched at her sides. She tried to deploy her usual manipulation tactics. She threatened to call the police and report me for conducting an illegal residential eviction. She pointed a rigid finger at my face, screaming that Travis had established permanent residency through his mail delivery. She proudly declared they held a signed lease agreement granting them 2 years of tenancy in the guest wing. I let her finish her desperate rant. I let her play her final hand. Then I delivered the reality check. Vanguard is a commercial holding corporation, I explained, keeping my tone flat and instructional. They purchased this estate as a commercial asset. Your backdated forged residential lease means nothing to a multi-billion-dollar company. They do not file civil eviction notices. They handle unauthorized occupants as criminal trespassers. You are no longer dealing with your daughter. You are dealing with a corporate legal department. Helen stumbled backward. Her heel caught the edge of the dining chair and she gripped the wooden backrest to steady herself. The mention of her forged lease paralyzed her. She realized her secret plot was exposed. Her grand strategy to declare me emotionally unstable and steal my assets had burned to the ground before she could even light the match. Across the room, Brittany finally grasped the severity of the situation. Her luxury lifestyle was evaporating right before her eyes. The free rent, the expensive camera, lighting the custom kitchen she used as a backdrop for her social media videos, it was all gone. She dropped to the floor next to her spilled water glass and began hyperventilating. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth, gasping for air. She cried out, asking where she was supposed to sleep tomorrow night. She looked at Travis, pleading with him to fix the disaster. Travis felt the weight of Brittany's desperate stare. He felt his fragile ego shattering in front of my mother. He needed to reclaim his dominance. He needed to prove he was still the man of the house. He pushed himself off the floor, his face flushed with a sudden reckless anger. He balled his hands into tight fists. He took 3 heavy, deliberate steps toward me. He lowered his head, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "You think you are so smart," Travis sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. "You think you can just snap your fingers and throw us out like trash? We are not going anywhere. I am not leaving this house. You are going to call these corporate suits right now and cancel the deal, or I am going to make you regret it." He took another step closer, invading my personal space. The scent of stale beer and cheap cologne radiated from his clothes. He raised his arm, attempting to trap me against the dining room wall. I did not flinch. I did not step away. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and pressed a single pre-programmed button on the security application. Travis scoffed, thinking I was bluffing. "You dialing the local cops?" he taunted. "Go ahead. Tell them your own family refuses to leave. They will laugh in your face and tell you to take it to civil court." I slid the phone back into my pocket. "I do not need to call the local police," I replied. "The new owners brought their own enforcement." A harsh electronic beep sounded from the front porch. The heavy mahogany door, which the delivery driver had left slightly ajar, swung wide open. The warm evening wind blew into the foyer, carrying the scent of impending rain. 2 men stepped out of the shadows and crossed the threshold into the bright hallway light. They did not wear standard police uniforms. They wore dark tactical clothing. Thick tactical vests strapped tightly across their chests bore the bold silver logo of Vanguard Security Operations. Heavy utility belts wrapped around their waists, holding radios, heavy-duty flashlights, and zip ties. They were tall, broad-shouldered professionals hired to protect corporate assets. They walked into the dining room with silent, calculated precision. Their stern faces showed zero interest in family drama. The lead contractor stopped a few feet away from Travis. He rested his hand on his utility belt and stared down at the grifter. Travis froze. His raised arm dropped slowly to his side. The fierce posture vanished instantly. He shrank back, taking clumsy steps away from me, his eyes darting between the 2 imposing figures blocking the exit. His fake toughness dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, emasculated fraud. The lead contractor pulled a clipboard from his side. He spoke with a deep, echoing authority. "We are authorized agents of Vanguard Management Group," the contractor stated. "We are taking physical inventory of this corporate site. We will monitor these premises for the next 24 hours to ensure no structural damage occurs and no fixtures are removed." He looked directly at Helen, then at Travis, and finally at Brittany sobbing on the floor. "You have until exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow evening to gather your personal clothing and vacate this property," the contractor continued. "If anyone remains inside these walls past the deadline, you will be detained and handed over to local law enforcement for criminal trespassing. There are no extensions, there are no exceptions." Helen covered her mouth with her trembling hand. A choked sob escaped her throat. The reality of her sudden homelessness finally crashed down upon her. She had spent the last 3 years treating me like a disposable bank account. She spent the last month orchestrating a hostile takeover of my life. Now she stood in a sterile dining room, listening to a stranger issue her final eviction notice. I turned my back on the pathetic scene. I walked over to the console table near the doorway and picked up my leather purse. I draped the strap over my shoulder. I walked past my mother. She reached out her fingers, brushing the sleeve of my blazer, begging me to stay and talk. I pulled my arm away without a second glance. I stepped carefully over the blue legal papers still scattered across the hardwood floor. I walked past Travis, who stood pressed against the wall, too terrified of the corporate guards to even look in my direction. I stepped through the front door and walked out into the humid Mississippi night. The air tasted fresh and clean. Behind me, the heavy mahogany door clicked shut. I left them locked inside a panic room of their own making, trapped with the cold reality of their upcoming deadline and entirely unprepared for the absolute devastation tomorrow morning would bring when the moving trucks finally arrived. Monday morning broke over Madison with a blinding glare. The Mississippi heat arrived early, baking the damp pavement and sending faint ripples of distortion rising from the asphalt. I parked my reliable sedan at the far end of the cul-de-sac, hidden under the thick shade of an old oak tree. The engine was off, the windows were rolled down just enough to let in the morning breeze. I held a paper cup of dark roast coffee, letting the warm cardboard heat my palms. I sat in silence and watched the heavy iron gates of my former estate. I did not have to wait long. A loud, grinding rumble shattered the quiet tranquility of the wealthy neighborhood. A bright orange moving truck turned the corner, its diesel engine struggling against the weight of a lifetime of accumulated possessions. The rented vehicle lumbered down the pristine street, looking like a dirty stain against the manicured lawns and sweeping driveways. Gary and Brenda sat in the cab. Travis had spent weeks feeding his parents a grand delusion. He promised them a free, luxurious retirement inside a multi-million-dollar mansion. He convinced them to sell their modest modular home down south, pack every single thing they owned into that cargo box, and drive up to claim their prize. The heavy truck groaned to a halt right in front of the iron gates. Gary honked the horn, a harsh, blaring sound that echoed down the block. He expected the gates to swing wide open. He expected his son to walk down the driveway and welcome him to a life of unearned privilege. Instead, he found a fortress. Behind the wrought iron bars, Vanguard Management Group had established an impenetrable perimeter. 2 Madison police cruisers sat parked horizontally across the concrete driveway, forming a solid steel barricade. Their roof lights flashed a silent, rhythmic warning of red and blue across the front of the grand estate. A strict line of Vanguard corporate security guards stood shoulder to shoulder behind the police vehicles, their dark tactical uniforms contrasting sharply with the bright morning sun. Gary pushed open the heavy door of the moving truck and climbed down. He wore a faded polo shirt and cargo shorts, carrying himself with the unearned swagger of a man who thought he held a winning lottery ticket. He marched up to the metal gates, gripping the iron bars with both hands, and rattled them loudly. He demanded someone open the entrance immediately. He yelled that his son lived inside, claiming his family held a legal right to access the grounds. A veteran police officer stepped out of the nearest cruiser. He adjusted his dark sunglasses and walked slowly toward the gate, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. He did not look amused. Gary puffed out his chest and launched into the script Travis had undoubtedly fed him. He threw around legal terms he clearly did not understand. He shouted about tenant protections, permanent residency, and squatters' rights. He insisted the police had no authority to block a civil housing dispute. He ordered the officer to step aside and let his moving truck onto the property. The veteran officer stopped 2 feet from the iron bars. He rested his right hand casually near his duty belt. He looked Gary up and down, sizing up the loud, arrogant man sweating on the sidewalk. The officer kept his voice low and firm. He informed Gary that the land was no longer a residential parcel. The deed belonged to a commercial holding corporation. The corporate owners had formally requested police presence to maintain civil order during an active trespassing removal. There were no tenant rights. There was no housing dispute. Gary turned red. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. He stepped closer to the bars, raising his voice even louder, spitting insults at the officer. He raised a clenched fist, threatening to force his way past the blockade if they did not produce the key. The officer did not flinch. His hand moved from his belt loop to the bright yellow grip of his taser. He unclipped the weapon with a loud, sharp snap. He stared dead into Gary's eyes. He issued a single warning: step back from the corporate boundary line or face immediate arrest for threatening an officer and attempting to breach private property. The sight of the unholstered weapon drained the false courage right out of Gary. He let go of the iron bars and stumbled backward, his hands raised in a sudden gesture of surrender. Brenda climbed down from the passenger side of the truck. She wore a cheap floral sundress and clutched a faux leather purse against her chest. Her eyes darted from the flashing police lights to her husband's terrified face. The grand retirement fantasy shattered on the hot Mississippi pavement. They realized this was not a welcoming party. This was a barricade. The loud confrontation drew an audience. Across the street, heavy wooden doors swung open. The wealthy doctors, lawyers, and business owners of the Madison Country Club stepped out onto their pristine front porches. They wore silk robes and held ceramic coffee mugs drawn outside by the screaming and the flashing police lights. These were the exact same neighbors my mother spent the last 3 years trying to impress. These were the women Helen bragged to over afternoon tea, spinning elaborate lies about our perfect wealthy family. Now those women stood on their lawns watching the horrific spectacle unfold. The heavy mahogany front doors of the estate finally opened. The Vanguard security team escorted the remaining trespassers out of the house. Travis walked first. He did not strut. His arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, nervous shuffle. He did not carry designer luggage. Vanguard gave them exactly 1 hour to gather their clothing, and they had no time to pack properly. Travis carried 2 oversized black plastic garbage bags slung over his shoulders. Brittany followed close behind him. Her face was red and swollen. Dark streaks of ruined makeup ran down her cheeks. She dragged a heavy trash bag behind her. The thin plastic caught on a sharp edge of the concrete driveway and ripped open. A pile of cheap high heels and tangled charging cables spilled onto the ground. A Vanguard guard ordered her to keep moving, refusing to let her stop and collect the scattered items. She left her shoes on the concrete, sobbing loudly as she trudged forward. Helen walked out last. My mother wore the same floral dress from the dinner disaster the night before. The fabric was wrinkled and stained with sweat. She clutched a single garbage bag tightly against her chest, looking like a refugee fleeing a disaster zone. As she walked down the long driveway, she looked up and saw her wealthy country club friends watching from across the street. The social devastation hit her like a physical blow. Helen raised her free hand, trying to shield her face from their judgmental stares, but it was useless. Her reputation evaporated into the humid morning air. She was exposed as a fraud, escorted off a corporate site by armed guards and police officers. The electronic gates buzzed and slowly rolled open just wide enough to let the 3 disgraced occupants slip through the gap. The moment Helen stepped onto the public sidewalk, the heavy iron doors slid shut and locked with a loud final click. Gary rushed forward, gesturing toward the rented moving truck. He told Travis to throw the garbage bags into the back of the cargo box. The police officer intervened before Travis could even take a step. The officer pointed a stern finger at Gary and informed him that the massive commercial vehicle was blocking a designated fire lane and obstructing a corporate access point. He ordered Gary to move the truck down to the public street immediately or face a severe traffic citation and an impound tow. Gary tried to argue, but the officer rested his hand back on his taser. Gary swallowed his pride, grabbed Brenda by the arm, and climbed back into the sweltering cab of the truck. The diesel engine roared back to life, and the vehicle lumbered away, leaving Travis, Brittany, and Helen standing alone on the sidewalk. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the baking asphalt, surrounded by their pathetic black trash bags. They had no access to the moving truck. They had no keys, no home, and no plan. Gary and Brenda parked the heavy truck 3 blocks away, sitting in the suffocating heat of the cab. They had sold their only home. They handed the small profit to debt collectors and the truck rental agency. Their entire life was packed into a metal box with absolutely nowhere to go. I sat in my air-conditioned sedan watching the scene from a safe distance. I took another slow sip of my coffee. The flavor was rich and perfect. The initial shock of homelessness is a terrifying experience, but the true nightmare begins when the adrenaline wears off. When predators lose their shelter and their easy prey, they do not band together. They turn their teeth toward each other. The toxic alliance that bonded them together was built entirely on greed. Without my money to steal and my roof to sleep under, that alliance was about to violently implode. The morning sun baked the Mississippi asphalt. The heat radiating from the street mirrored the intense panic boiling over on the sidewalk. Helen, Brittany, and Travis stood next to their black plastic trash bags. The Vanguard security guards remained at their posts behind the iron gates, their arms crossed, watching the disgraced family sweat. The adrenaline of the sudden eviction evaporated. The crushing weight of immediate homelessness settled squarely on their shoulders. Travis looked down the street toward the public road. His rusted pickup truck sat parked by the curb. His parents waited 3 blocks away in a sweltering moving truck. He had no cash. He had no job. He turned his head and looked at my sister. Brittany knelt on the hard concrete, desperately trying to shove her expensive high heels back into the torn plastic bag. Her face was a messy portrait of ruined makeup and fresh tears. She looked up at Travis, her eyes pleading for a plan. She expected him to take charge. She expected him to act like the wealthy entrepreneur he pretended to be. Instead, Travis let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He dropped his own trash bags onto the grass. The illusion was dead, and he had no reason to keep playing the loving boyfriend. He told Brittany to stop crying. His voice lacked any trace of comfort. It was sharp and full of deep disgust. He looked at the girl he spent the last month flattering and told her she was entirely useless. Brittany froze her hands, trembling over her shoes. She asked him what he meant. Travis did not hold back. The brutal truth spilled from his mouth, stripping away every lie he ever told her. He stated he never cared about her fake influencer career. He mocked her makeup videos. He admitted right there on the public sidewalk that he only dated her for access. He wanted the Madison mansion. He wanted the free meals, the air conditioning, and the unlimited access to my bank accounts. He pointed a finger at her tear-stained face. He said she was just a convenient key to a wealthy kingdom. Now that the kingdom belonged to a commercial corporation, she offered him zero value. She was just a broke girl sitting on the curb with a bag of tangled phone chargers. Helen stepped forward, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her shock. She raised her hand, threatening to slap Travis for speaking to her daughter that way. She demanded he show some respect. Travis swatted her hand away. He laughed directly in my mother's face. He told Helen she was just as delusional as her daughter. He mocked her grand plan to forge a lease, calling her a fool for thinking she could outsmart a corporate legal department. Without another word of explanation, Travis bent down and scooped up his 2 black bags. He turned his back on the crying women. He marched down the street toward his rusted pickup truck. Brittany scrambled to her feet, screaming his name. She chased after him for a few steps, begging him not to leave her stranded. She promised they could figure something out. She promised she would find a way to get my money back. Travis ignored her. He tossed his bags into the truck bed, climbed into the cab, and slammed the door. The loud engine roared to life. He merged into the morning traffic and sped away, leaving a cloud of dark exhaust smoke hanging in the humid air. He abandoned her on the spot, cutting his losses the moment the grift fell apart. 5 miles away, the atmosphere could not have been more different. I sat in a quiet, air-conditioned coffee shop in downtown Jackson. Soft jazz played from the overhead speakers. The smell of freshly roasted espresso beans filled the cool room. I sat at a small corner table savoring a vanilla latte, watching the busy city streets through a large pane of tinted glass. My phone rested face up on the wooden table. The screen illuminated every few minutes. The notifications piled up. Missed call from Helen. Missed call from Helen. Missed call from Helen. I did not answer. I took a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for her to leave a voicemail. I wanted to hear the exact moment her arrogance broke. A small icon appeared, signaling a recorded message. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. The first voicemail started with her familiar commanding tone. Helen demanded I answer the phone. She ordered me to call the Vanguard security team and authorize her to go back inside. She claimed she left important documents in the kitchen drawer. She threatened to sue me for emotional distress. Her voice shook, but she still tried to play the role of the dictator. I deleted the message. I waited 10 minutes. The phone buzzed again. The second voicemail sounded entirely different. The false bravado was gone. The harsh reality of standing on the hot pavement with a sobbing, dumped daughter had finally registered. Helen spoke in a rapid, frantic pace. She asked how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. She described the heat. She mentioned the neighbors watching her from their porches. The humiliation was eating her alive. I deleted that message too. The third voicemail arrived 15 minutes later. This time I heard nothing but raw, unfiltered desperation. Helen was hyperventilating. Her words were choked with heavy, dramatic sobs. She begged for a hotel room. She pleaded for a small cash wire transfer just to get them through the night. She promised she would never bother me again if I just gave them a few $100s. The arrogant matriarch who demanded I move out of my own home the night before was now begging for spare change. I lowered the phone from my ear. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I remembered the shattered mahogany bookshelves. I remembered the stolen emergency credit card. I remembered the secret patio conversation where she plotted to lock me in a psychiatric facility to steal my life. They orchestrated their own downfall. They lit the match, and now they were begging me to put out the fire. I opened my contacts list. I selected my mother's profile. I pressed the block button, severing the connection instantly. Her calls would never reach my device again. But I was not finished. The phone in Helen's hand, the device she used to leave those hysterical voicemails, belonged to an account I paid for every single month. Brittany's phone, the one she used to film her fake influencer content, was also attached to my billing cycle. For years, I covered their cellular expenses because it was easier than listening to them complain. I opened my web browser and logged into my cellular provider portal. The screen loaded, displaying 3 active lines under my name. I clicked on my sister's phone number. I navigated to the line management settings. The system asked for a confirmation reason. I selected the option for a lost or stolen device. I hit the deactivate button. I repeated the exact same process for my mother's number. I clicked the red confirmation box. The digital commands processed through the network. In an instant, miles away, on that blistering sidewalk, the signal bars on their screens vanished. The service icons disappeared, their expensive smartphones transformed into useless bricks of glass and metal. In one swift, silent stroke, I cut the final financial tethers binding us together. I removed their ability to call a taxi, search for a hotel, or reach out to distant relatives with a fabricated sob story. I left them entirely isolated on the side of the road. They had no money, no shelter, and now no communication. They were left to face the brutal consequences of their own greed. I finished my latte, set the empty cup on the table, and walked out of the coffee shop. The heavy lifting was done. The toxic elements were amputated from my life. The parasites were swept away, leaving me to step into a new chapter of unbothered peace, while they prepared to face a level of ruin they never saw coming. The fallout from that humid Monday morning did not just happen overnight. It unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck over the following weeks. The universe possesses a very strict accounting system. When predators gamble with the hard work of others, the house always wins. Gary and Brenda drove their rented moving truck away from my former iron gates with nowhere to go. Travis had fed them a magnificent lie about a free luxury retirement. Based on that fabricated promise, they sold their modest modular home. The small profit they made barely covered their outstanding credit card debt and the exorbitant daily rental fees for the giant cargo truck. By the end of the week, the rental agency demanded the vehicle back. Gary and Brenda were forced to unload their entire lifetime of belongings into a cheap, unventilated storage unit they could barely afford. Without the cash to secure a traditional residential lease, they ended up at a dilapidated roadside motel on the gritty outskirts of Jackson. The property featured a flickering red neon sign, peeling exterior paint, and the constant roar of heavy freight trucks driving down the adjacent interstate. They crammed their remaining suitcases into a single, dingy room, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and damp carpet. Travis dragged right down into the mud alongside them. The grifter, who spent his afternoons lounging in my custom leather chairs, now slept on a sagging rollaway cot, squeezed between a rusted radiator and a cheap television set. He had no money, no girlfriend to sponge off, and zero prospects. The cramped quarters bred intense hostility. Gary finally realized his son was not a brilliant entrepreneur, but a lazy fraud. He yelled at Travis daily, demanding he find a job to pay for their meager meals of cheap fast food. Travis shouted back, refusing to accept responsibility for the disaster. The toxic family dynamic they used to weaponize against me now turned inward, tearing them apart in a tiny, noisy motel room. While the Vance family festered on the edge of town, my mother faced a different kind of execution. Helen built her entire identity around her social standing in Madison. She thrived on the envy of her wealthy peers. But the affluent ecosystem of a southern country club is unforgiving. The women who watched the police cruisers block my driveway did not keep that secret to themselves. The gossip spread through the neighborhood faster than a summer wildfire. By Tuesday morning, everyone knew Helen Garcia was escorted off a corporate property by armed guards. They knew she did not own the estate she constantly bragged about. Her carefully crafted facade shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. Helen tried to pretend nothing happened. She put on a brave face, wore her best floral dress, and drove to the country club for her weekly brunch circle. She walked into the elegant dining room, expecting her friends to greet her with warm smiles. Instead, a chilling silence fell over the room. Women turned their heads suddenly, fascinated by their menus or their iced teas. No one pulled out a chair for her. No one offered a greeting. The social exile was immediate and permanent. Stripped of her status and cut off from my bank accounts, Helen could no longer afford her comfortable lifestyle. She was forced to quietly pack her remaining pride and downsize. She moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in an undesirable complex on the opposite side of the county. Her new reality consisted of listening to her neighbors argue through thin walls and staring at a view of a cracked asphalt parking lot. The woman who once demanded the keys to my empire now spent her evenings sitting alone in a tiny living room surrounded by cheap furniture, drowning in the shame she engineered for herself. She had no one to manipulate and no audience to hear her complaints. But the harshest dose of reality landed squarely on my sister. Brittany had spent her entire adult life wrapped in a protective bubble of delusion. She refused to hold a job. She treated my home like a free photography studio. She treated my credit cards like an unlimited allowance. When Travis abandoned her on the sidewalk and I deactivated her phone, that bubble burst. She had no skills, no college degree, and zero work experience. For the first few nights, she slept on a worn-out couch in the apartment of a reluctant former high school friend. Realizing she had to feed herself, Brittany took the expensive camera equipment she bought with my stolen money and walked into a local pawn shop. The owner gave her a fraction of the retail value. It was barely enough cash to secure a security deposit on a dark, damp room rented out of a stranger's basement. The influencer dream died an ugly death. To pay her weekly rent, Brittany had to face the grueling reality of actual labor. She applied for a job at a busy, greasy diner located right off the highway. The management handed her a stiff polyester uniform and a damp rag. The girl who once complained that my pristine guest room lacked proper natural light now spent her days wiping sticky syrup off laminate tables. Her shifts lasted 10 agonizing hours. She carried heavy trays of hot food, her feet throbbing inside cheap non-slip shoes. She endured impatient customers shouting about cold coffee. She scrubbed greasy kitchen floors at midnight under the harsh glare of fluorescent bulbs. The physical toll erased her pampered lifestyle. The expensive manicures gave way to calloused, cracked hands, smelling of fryer oil and bleach. Every single time her back ached or a manager scolded her for moving too slow, she was forced to remember what she threw away. She traded a life of effortless luxury inside a pristine estate for a minimum wage nightmare. A few months prior, she lived rent-free in a mansion. Now she counted loose coins from her tip jar just to afford cheap groceries. They all played a dangerous game of greed. They looked at my success and decided it was their birthright. They conspired, they manipulated, and they planned to destroy my sanity just to take my keys. They tried to steal an empire without doing a single day of the hard labor required to build one. In the process, they burned their own lives straight to the ground. The justice delivered by the universe was swift, poetic, and undeniable. I watched the ashes of their schemes blow away in the wind, leaving my own path clear and unobstructed. The toxic storm was finally over. The battlefield was swept clean. Now it was time for me to enjoy the quiet, unbothered peace I purchased with my own blood, sweat, and legal brilliance. My new life was waiting, and it was more beautiful than they could ever imagine. The Vanguard transaction generated a staggering sum of liquid cash. I did not let those funds sit idle in an offshore account. I used the money to build an impenetrable fortress. I searched for a property far away from the toxic country club gossip and the suffocating memories of Madison. I found my new sanctuary exactly 2 hours north, nestled deep inside an exclusive, heavily wooded neighborhood. The new estate sat at the end of a long, winding private road. High stone walls surrounded the perimeter. Wrought iron gates, thicker and taller than my last ones, guarded the entrance. When I drove my sedan through those gates for the first time, the heavy metal doors clicked shut behind me. The sound resonated like a vault locking into place. The air up here tasted different. It tasted like freedom. True wealth is not just about hoarding money. It is about recognizing the people who stand by you when the pressure rises. Throughout the entire covert operation, I had a silent partner. Maria was my executive logistics assistant. While Travis and Brittany treated me like a servant, Maria stayed late at the corporate office, handling my freight schedules. She was the one who rented the midnight storage unit under a corporate alias. She drove behind my sedan in the dead of night, helping me load heavy boxes of family silver and antique oil paintings into the secure facility. She kept her mouth shut and executed the plan flawlessly. I called Maria into my new corner office on a Friday morning. I handed her a thick white envelope. Inside sat a bonus check large enough to pay off her remaining student loans, along with a revised employment contract detailing a permanent 30% salary increase. Maria opened the envelope and covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. She tried to refuse the money, claiming she was just doing her job. I shook my head and pushed the envelope back across the desk. I told her, "Loyalty is the rarest currency on earth, and I always pay my debts." I watched her walk out of my office with her head held high. It felt good to reward honest labor. It felt even better knowing my sister was scrubbing diner floors for pennies while a hard-working woman received the compensation she actually deserved. My new home featured high vaulted ceilings and wide windows overlooking a dense pine forest. I spent my first weekend walking through the quiet halls. My low heels clicked against polished hardwood. There were no dirty boots tracking mud across my rugs. There were no crusted cereal bowls left on the pristine marble kitchen counters. The heavy silence felt therapeutic. I walked into my new home office. The room smelled of fresh paint and rich mahogany. I ran my hand along the edge of the custom-built bookshelves lining the far wall. The smooth wood felt cool beneath my fingertips. No unvetted construction workers stood in this room. No grifter held a sledgehammer ready to destroy my career. This sanctuary belonged to me alone. I carried a small, heavy item wrapped in soft cloth into the room. I peeled back the fabric to reveal my late father's vintage watch box. The dark wood still gleamed untouched by the garbage bag Travis threw it into. I walked over to the stone fireplace and placed the heirloom gently on the center of the mantel. I stood back and stared at it for a long time. The memory of my father's hard work lived on in this quiet room. I protected the legacy he left behind. The contrast between my old life and my new reality was stark. For years, I woke up dreading the inevitable demands. My mother always needed a favor. My sister always needed cash. They viewed my energy as a bottomless well they could drain without consequence. Now, my phone never rang with fabricated emergencies. No one demanded my vehicle for a weekend trip. No one expected me to apologize for protecting my own property. I successfully amputated the diseased limbs from my family tree. I did not engage in screaming matches on the front lawn. I did not throw their clothes out the window in a fit of uncontrollable rage. I used my intellect. I weaponized the law. I let them sit at my dining table planning my psychological ruin while I quietly signed the paperwork that dismantled their entire existence. I fought a war without firing a single physical shot. A signature on a corporate contract proved deadlier than any insult they could throw at me. Every time I poured a cup of coffee in my quiet kitchen, I pictured my mother sitting in her cramped apartment, listening to her neighbors argue through paper-thin walls. She traded a luxury estate for a concrete box, all because she could not curb her own greed. Every time I drove my sedan to the logistics center, I pictured Travis sleeping on a rusted cot in a noisy motel room, stripped of his unearned pride. Every time I purchased a new piece of art to hang in my secure hallway, I thought about Brittany wiping sticky syrup off a diner table. The guilt they expected me to feel never arrived. Society conditions women to be the eternal peacekeepers. We are taught to swallow our anger, apologize for our success, and set ourselves on fire to keep our relatives warm. My mother banked on that exact conditioning. She assumed I would surrender my mental health and my financial empire just to maintain the title of a good daughter. She underestimated the cold resolve of a woman pushed to the absolute brink. I refused to be a martyr. I chose to be an architect. I designed a labyrinth, invited them inside, and locked the exit. Friday evening arrived, bringing a cool breeze that swept through the pine trees surrounding my estate. I finished my weekly logistics reports, closed my laptop, and walked into the kitchen. I opened a bottle of vintage Cabernet, the exact same vintage Travis poured for my mother on the patio the night they plotted to steal my life. I poured the dark red wine into a crystal glass. I unlocked the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto my expansive back patio. The stone terrace overlooked a deep valley. The setting sun painted the sky in vivid shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. I sat down in a plush outdoor chair and rested my feet on the low stone wall. A pair of hawks circled high above the tree line, riding the thermal currents in perfect, undisturbed silence. I took a slow sip of the wine. The complex flavors settled on my tongue. I did not have to look over my shoulder. I did not have to hide my valuables in a steel safe. The war was over, and the victor was enjoying the spoils. People often mistake silence for surrender. They view a quiet demeanor as a weakness waiting to be exploited. My family saw my patience as an open invitation to pillage my hard work. They thought because I did not scream, I did not know how to fight. But true power does not need to raise its voice. True power operates in the shadows, reviewing contracts and securing assets while the fools celebrate a false victory. Let this be a harsh lesson to anyone who thinks they can outsmart a woman who built her own empire from nothing. Never mistake a woman's silence for weakness, because while you are plotting to take her home, she is already signing the paperwork to destroy yours.